Johann Sebastian Bach is considered the undisputed master of the art of the fugue. His ability to weave extraordinary lines of counterpoint around ingenious subjects is unparalleled in the history of Western classical music. One of his most important keyboard works, the Well-Tempered Clavier, displays his virtuosity in this regard. The sheer variety of techniques used in this work demonstrates an almost encyclopedic understanding of fugue realization. Inversion, stretto, diminution, and augmentation, multiple subjects, all combined with masterful counterpoint and airtight formal structures to create miniature keyboard masterpieces. A well-known anecdote relating to Bach tells how he and his son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, would often attend concerts by other keyboardists of the time. In those days, keyboardists would mostly give concerts of their own works, and many such works would be fugues. It is said that the two Bachs would discuss their opinions upon hearing the subject of the fugue, on how they thought the subject should be realized in the remainder of the work. Apparently, the structure of the fugue subject itself, in their learned minds, implied a certain kind of realization appropriate to that structure. The subject itself became the basis and the limitation for how the fugue should be constructed, like a kind of weave pattern permeating the entire length of a fabric. This anecdote became the inspiration for this lecture, which will attempt to recreate in some small way the thought process Bach might have had when writing 3 of the fugue subjects from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. It will attempt to show how elements that appear in the midst of the body of the fugue exist in seed form in the structure of the fugue subject. It will look for rhythmic, formal, harmonic, and melodic elements that are either explicit or implicit in the fugue subject that are then exploited by the composer to create a concise but fully realized work of logic and beauty. If we are successful, we will see how each work is an organic and natural outgrowth of the powerful potential of its subject. The first fugue we will examine is the F-sharp minor fugue from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Like many fugues, this subject, when first heard alone, has a number of ambiguous elements. First and foremost is rhythm. Assuming the listener does not know the time signature of 6/4, they will have difficulty hearing the compound meter, as the first 2 downbeats are disguised, the first by a rest and the second by a tie. The head of the subject is distinguished by 3 ascending gestures, each more urgent than the last, which also serve to hide from the ear of the listener a clear understanding of the compound meter. The main reason for this is the second of the 3 gestures, which reaches its goal early, on a weak beat instead of on one of the 2 strong beats. Even the tail of the subject disguises the compound meter, with its trill that begins on a weak beat as well. It is only after the entrance of the second voice that we can begin to have a clear understanding of the meter. Also important from the standpoint of rhythm is the element of space. Each ascending gesture is followed by a long note, a moment of respite from the somber but increasingly agitated movement of the subject. This agitation is created through the rhythm by the progressive shortening of each long note, as well as the rhythmic character of each gesture. The first ascending gesture is in quarter notes, followed by a dotted half tied to a quarter. The second essentially doubles the speed of the first, with 2/8 followed by a half, and the third picks up where the second leaves off, expanding the ascending portion to 4/8 notes and shortening the subsequent long note to a dotted quarter, which is then followed by the tail of the subject. Thus, each ascending gesture becomes more urgent than the last, creating a tension highlighted by the rhythmic ambiguity of the subject, which is only relieved by the tonal resolution of the subject tail and the following entrance of the second voice. Another source of ambiguity present in the subject itself is that of tonality. Like many of Bach's fugue subjects, this one makes skillful use of chromaticism, affecting a sort of mini-modulation from one ascending gesture to the next. The first gesture itself does not immediately reveal the tonality to the listener, who may hear these 3 notes as 1, 2, 3 in a minor key, or 6, 7, 8 in a major key. Rather than resolve this ambiguity, Bach complicates it by transposing the original gesture chromatically up a whole step, thereby recreating the original tonal ambiguity, 1, 2, 3, or 6, 7, 8, in a new key. The third gesture is also transposed up a whole step, though the tonal ambiguity is lessened somewhat by the addition of a lower neighbor, which clearly indicates C sharp as the tonal center of this third gesture. Here, at the arrival of the dominant, the subject then returns to the tonality of F sharp, which only at this moment becomes clear with a plain enunciation of the F sharp minor scale and the cadential trill figure. The effect of the subject, seen through the combination of rhythm and melody, is thus a progressive agitation applied in chromatic layers, built up to the dominant note, and then resolved into the tonic. Furthermore, we see that the number 3 plays an important role at several different layers. First, in the 3-note ascending gesture. Second, on the number of ascending gestures. Third, in the compound meter itself. And fourth, in the length of the entire subject, which is 3 measures. The large-scale realization of this fugue subject plays on the tonal and rhythmic ambiguity in several ways. To some extent, the entrance of the other voices lessens the tonal ambiguity, and we see that Bach treats the harmonic realization of the fugue subject the same each time. 1, 4, 5, 7, 1, 5, 7, 1. However, this basic harmonic framework is greatly ornamented through the use of chromaticism, first present in the subject itself, and then markedly displayed in the counter-subject with its 2-note slur motive. Thus, the counter-subject plays a dual and perhaps contradictory role. It stabilizes the sense of harmonic progression, while simultaneously adding to the chromaticism of the fugue subject. Rhythmically, it plays a very similar role. While its presence does give greater definition to the compound meter, the rhythm of the counter-subject, especially when viewed in light of its chromatic implications, is unpredictable, and when viewed in its own light just as rhythmically ambiguous as the subject itself. Only when subject and counter-subject are combined, as they are consistently throughout the remainder of the fugue, do meter and tonality become stabilized, though still fluid and dynamic. These complementary rhythmic and tonal techniques are carried over into the episodes, where overlapping voices and chromatic inflections still play an important role. In the short episode following the second subject statement, for example, Bach uses both rhythmic and tonal layering in imitation of the subject itself. Here, the presence of the lower voice allows us to maintain close contact with the sense of compound meter, while the ascending sequential pattern is highly suggestive of the fugue subject. The episode at measures 13 and 14 demonstrates how the layering effect can also be sent in the reverse direction. Here, a falling fifths chord progression is downplayed by the foreground technique of overlapping voices, which again give the impression of movement by step, this time in the downward direction. Realizing that the layering effect can be made use of in both directions, Bach naturally applies the principle of inversion to the fugue subject, first at measures 20 through 23, then at measures 32 through 35. At measure 20, the chromaticism of the original subject is just as present, though here sharps are subtracted instead of added. At the same time, the 2-note slur figure from the original counter-subject is also present, though not in the same rhythmic form, preferring instead to meander through a constant series of 8th notes in the lowest voice. Thus, the harmonic implications of the inverted subject are much more ambiguous in the treatment of the prime form, both here and in the later presentation, and both places, therefore, among the most chromatic of the entire fugue. Like the small-scale structure of the fugue subject, the large-scale structure of the entire work makes use of the number 3 as well. There are 3 large sections to the work: the exposition, from measure 1 to the cadence at measure 18, the tonally wandering middle section from measure 18 to the cadence at measure 32, and the final section from measure 32 to the end. Interestingly, though this work is written for a total of 4 voices, throughout the second large section of the work there are no more than 3 voices present at any time. Only at the beginning of the third section does the 4th voice re-enter, remaining until the end of the work. It is well known that Bach often made use of number symbolism in his music, and here the number 3 appears to play an important role, integrating the subject to the whole of the work, the smallest details with a large-scale picture. The C minor fugue from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier could hardly be more different from the F-sharp minor fugue. While the F-sharp minor fugue, with its complications and complexities of rhythm and harmony, is the picture of high Baroque aesthetics, the C minor fugue is almost classical in comparison. Like the F-sharp minor fugue, it is also made up of 3 motivic gestures, but these, rather than obscuring harmony and rhythm, serve to make it as distinct as possible. The beginning 3 notes of each gesture, with their combination of tonic and leading tone, clearly set the ear on the tonality of C minor. The following portions of each gesture then serve to progressively delineate the remainder of the C minor scale. The first brings in A flat, the second G, and the third F and E flat. Thus, a rather Schenkerian view can be taken of the fugue subject with a background Erlini of G with an upper neighbor of A flat, F, and E flat. Furthermore, if we look toward the entrance of the second voice, we see the descending C minor scale in its entirety, giving us the remaining D and C at the bottom of the scale. Thus, we again see Bach's ability to both reflect large-scale structures and small ones, and his ability to simultaneously allow them to complement and complete each other. In addition to the clear tonal delineation of the subject, the distinct rhythmic character is significant as well. The rhythmic figure 16th, 16th, 8th, 8th, 8th is clearly the underlying motivic force behind the entire work, and there are a total of 3 measures in which it does not appear in some guise or another. While the intervallic content of the rhythmic gesture can be altered, as in the first episode in which the descending interval is stretched to a 6th, it is significant that Bach never inverts the subject. This relates also to the power of a Schenkerian analysis of this subject, wherein a descending line carries more weight than an ascending line. In this context, an inversion of this subject would seem trite and artificial, and would add a layer of intellectualism inappropriate to the clear classical nature of this subject. In the true classical tradition here, Bach does more with less, making a scale out of a gesture and a piece out of a motive. A look at the counter subject reveals Bach's intention to interfere as little as possible with the character of his subject. Besides the opening descending scale, which characterizes all appearance of the counter subject, which always appears with the subject, the rhythmic character of the counter subject is exceedingly simple, consisting merely of a series of accompanying 8th notes, almost in the character of a basso continuo. Interestingly, it is the scale pattern of the counter subject that receives the most diverse treatment in this fugue, both in terms of rhythm and tonality. It appears as a descending melodic minor scale beginning and ending on the tonic in measure 3 and measure 15, a melodic minor scale beginning and ending on the 4th scale degree in measure 25, a natural minor scale beginning and ending on the 4th scale degree in measure 7 and measure 20, and a descending major scale in measure 11. It can be inverted and rhythmically offset, as in measures 5 and 6 and measures 17 and 18. It can be sequenced and extended, as in measures 9 and 10 and measures 22 through 25. And it can be sequenced, extended, and inverted, as in measures 13 and 14. The generic character of the scale allows it to be a useful accompaniment to the subject and occasionally a secondary subject on its own. It is a rhythmic force in and of itself, second in importance only to the original motivic rhythm of the subject. In keeping with the principles of classical clarity and conservatism, a second counter subject consistently appears with the subject and acts as a complement to the original counter subject. This second counter subject receives the most diverse treatment of the 3 subjects in terms of interval content, but rhythmically it is always the same, distinguished by its conspicuous rest and last-second echoing of the original subject's rhythm. The combination of subject, counter-subject, and second counter-subject forms a clear harmonic progression at the appearance of each subject, further underscoring the classical sensibility. 1, 4, 1, 5, 7, 1. While this underlying harmonic sense is not especially covert in the original presentation of the subject, it is made especially obvious when all 3 subjects are present simultaneously. Large-scale perspectives reveal a more classical aesthetic at work in this piece as well. First, the two-measure length of the subject itself, as opposed to the three measures of the F-sharp minor subject, is more classical in nature, and nearly the entire work can be divided into two-measure presentations of the subject or two-measure episodes. In true keeping with the Baroque Fortspannung principle, there are several places that break the two-measure rule, such as the episode at measures 17 through 19 and measures 24 through 26, but generally the two-measure rule holds true. At an even deeper level, a sort of quasi-sonata form can be discerned. The first section, or exposition, would begin in C minor, modulating to E-flat major and cadencing in measure 13. Measures 13 through 20 would be a sort of development, with their frequent changes of key and sequencing patterns. Measure 20 sees the return of the C minor tonality, a kind of recapitulation, which remains more or less in play until the cadence in measure 29. The remainder of the work is a short codetta and final statement of the fugue subject. Thus, the C minor fugue, in contrast to the F-sharp minor fugue, presents a picture of classical techniques and sensibilities through its use of motive, phrasing, and structure. The C-sharp minor fugue from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier is well known for its sheer complexity and compositional virtuosity. Therefore, it is interesting that its initial subject is in fact quite simple, consisting only of 5 notes. These 5 notes, however, are densely packed with harmonic implications that are not initially obvious to the listener. The subject instead presents itself as a very terse melodic statement, distinguished primarily by its interval of an ascending diminished fourth. Stylistically, this type of fugue subject harkens back to an older Fuchsian stile antico counterpoint, and it is in this manner that Bach first begins to work out his five-part realization of the subject. That is, primarily in a linear melodic fashion, as opposed to a more vertically integrated harmonic style. The first 35 measures of the work are in this older style, with constantly shifting modes and harmonic twists that subvert what would normally be considered a standard, tonally functional interpretation. We also find linear motives pass between the voices, as in the lowest voice in measures 5 through 6, followed by the second lowest voice in measures 8 through 9, quasi-countersubjects that don't qualify strictly as countersubjects because of their inconsistency of use. The three-note descending motive, for example, as seen in measures 7, 9, 10, 11, and others, acts as a sort of recurring motivic element, much in the way that motives are passed between voices in the works of William Byrd and other late Renaissance composers. That is to say, that the principle of imitation is applied throughout this section, but not in the strict manner associated with the Baroque fugue, more rather as a kind of general technique, a glue that holds the five voices together in a common purpose. The original subject thus becomes almost secondary to this interchange between voices, an excuse to create a richly, densely woven counterpoint. By the end of this opening section, the fugue subject has become almost lost in the tangle of voices, as can be seen in its inconspicuous entrances at measures 29 and 32. Measure 35 marks an abrupt break with both the previous section and its style of counterpoint. First, two of the voices drop out, leaving a thinner texture in which the original subject can again be clearly distinguished. It is at this point, however, that Bach introduces the second subject, a figure of seemingly generic passage work appearing in juxtaposition with the first subject. The importance of this second subject cannot be overlooked, though, for it allows us for the first time to plainly hear the harmonic implications that existed in seed form in the first subject from the beginning. 1, 5, 1, 5 sus4 resolving to 3, 1. The lowest voice here has also conceded to the newly adopted harmonic approach, and complements the first subject with notes that support the above harmonic reading. The second subject, in addition to providing us with a harmonic framework, has two other important characteristics. First, it imparts an energy and vitality to the piece that did not exist in the first 35 measures. And second, it provides Bach with more pliable compositional material. It can be inverted, intervallically altered, and extended indefinitely. Or put another way, the unending series of eighth notes that continues unbroken from measure 35 to measure 94 can inconspicuously slide in and out of the second subject almost at will, passing as it does from one voice to another. A third subject announces its entrance in measures 49 and 50, and is the most forceful and declamatory of the three subjects. Here and elsewhere it appears in conjunction with the other two subjects, thereby creating a powerful trio of voices that complement each other and make even more explicit the underlying 1, 5, 1, 5, 1 harmonic progression. In fact, it could be said that the true subject of this fugue is the simultaneous combination of these three subjects, and that each subject by itself is in some manner incomplete. The first subject, after all, is quite short and ambiguous. The second is almost too generic to be considered a true subject, and the third is more motivic than thematic. It is only when these three complementary subjects are combined, as they first are in measures 49 and 50, do we get a true sense of their implications that exist only in potential by themselves. As voices pile upon voices throughout the remainder of the fugue, each of the three subjects slip comfortably into the role afforded them by their nature. The original subject takes on the most accompanimental role, providing the harmonic framework for subsequent subject combinations. The second subject meanders throughout the entire texture, energizing it and making explicit the harmonic implications of the first subject. And the third subject takes on the role of a true motive, passing between the voices in imitation, much as the motive of the C minor fugue did. In this sense, the C-sharp minor fugue becomes greater than the sum of its parts, developing step by step into a work of stunning beauty and complexity. The three fugues discussed in this lecture exemplify in small part the absolutely extraordinary capacity of Johann Sebastian Bach to create miniature masterpieces of both beauty and logic. If we weren't aware of the great composer's genius, we might suppose that these three fugues were written by three different composers. The F-sharp minor showed us the height of Baroque complexity and expression. The C minor fugue looked forward to the leaner stylings of the classical era. And the C-sharp minor fugue looked back to an older canonic imitative style, while simultaneously integrating current Baroque techniques as well. My hope is that we have been able, in some small way, to understand Bach's thought process as he sat down to write a fugue subject. Indeed, he was not simply writing a nice melody. He was composing an entire piece in the few strokes of pen it took to write his immaculately planned fugue subjects. By creating a subject, Bach was creating an entire composition. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I hope that we've been able to, in some small way, shed some light on the genius of Johann Sebastian Bach.